Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. I wanted to break a little bit of new ground technologically and deliver a web-based presentation, which I will, and with a fair bit of kind of apprehension as to whether or not I can get all this to work. And being a Mac guy, I've got my Mac laptop, and we had a bit of a connection problem, so my Mac is out of the picture, and I'm going to try and discover Windows in the next few minutes. But we'll start with a bit of PowerPoint, and one way or another, it's going to work out. If I'm speaking too quietly, please yell at me, or if I'm speaking too loudly, yell at me even more. I thought I would probably deliver a bit of a message that managing Alberta's forest ecosystems in the future would be increasingly challenging, and I sat through this morning's presentations and learned a lot, and I can't imagine even one of them didn't emphasize the unbelievable uncertainty and complexity that confronts Alberta's forest systems, whether it's from the standpoint of land uses or natural disturbances. And looking around this room, I see some people almost as old as me and a bunch of youngsters. Those that are older have already seen phenomenal changes in these systems. And as we pass on, those of you that are younger, as we think about Rick and Aaron's presentations, are reminded that if we thought what's changed a lot in the past, it's only going to continue. I kind of wanted to tackle it from a slightly different perspective. Largely, it's about money. Money drives a lot of things. So when you look at the global economy, and yeah, it varies a little bit country to country, but most economies are driven by 4 commodity productions. The production of food, the production of wood fiber, the production of hydrocarbons, and the production of ore, non-energy ore. And it's my view that to a large extent, societies have done a really good job on the industry side and government of explaining to the public the benefits that come out of these land uses, the jobs, the royalties, and rents, the things that create the Alberta advantage. It's my view that to a large extent, we haven't historically helped the public understand that there's a trade-off and there's a balance. That along with these land uses and all the benefits they create, there's also challenges, there's liabilities. And so I think that historic inequity in discussion is becoming more apparent, and I think it's gradually going to be resolved with a more balanced conversation. I think this story could be told at almost any spatial scale. So what I'm going to do maybe to start this. Let's see. Yeah, how do I make this work? I think that might work. Let's see. Perhaps. Maybe not. Okay. You know, you can tell it at any global scale, but I'd like to talk about it in the context of Alberta. It's a place we know. Here's about a 10-year decade. We're looking at investment dollars. This is all the money coming in for everything we build in the province of Alberta. Back in 1998, it was around $60 billion, and basically a decade later, it was $250 billion. Okay? So, it's, yeah, $250 billion, $250 billion. It takes us about 5 years to turn risk capital into physical stuff, building roads, building hospitals, building buildings like this. This is all the money for everything we're building in Alberta. So if you fly over the province, the money required to build it would be in charts like this. And of course, this is 2008, and it's continued to grow today, so it's now more like $0.45 trillion. So, point here is that you guys work in a province that has more risk capital coming into it in an area that's 68 million hectares than any other landscape in North America. It's a busy place. Okay, and it's got a history. We talked before that glacial ice sheets basically finished disappearing from most of Alberta about 9,000 years ago. And since then, there's been a trajectory and sequence of land use. For many thousands of years, First Nations people were the land use, making decisions in space and time. And then the arrival of European people, so we're talking about the early and mid-1800s, and the very first land use, of course, was that of harvesting bison to extinction, creating a lot of hides, a lot of meat, and a lot of bone. That bone was shipped out east, and it secured the land base away from First Nations people. There's a time where everyone in this room, if we were living back in the late 1800s in Alberta, would have been involved directly or indirectly with trapping, and I mean everyone. As the European population grew, they needed houses to live in, they needed fuel to burn, and we have a forest sector. I wish we had good records back then of where we logged and how much, because it's hard to kind of reconstruct the forest history of this province prior to about 1930. And we had the arrival of a coal mining industry, which is so important in terms of heating houses and cooking food. So these land uses arrive, they grow, and these two continue to exist. The food industry starts, it'd be cattle, pigs, and crops, and very vibrant land use that drives this province for many, many decades and continues to be important. In 1947, the Duke No. 1 blows in, and Alberta changes in a profound way. But no more so than the arrival of the first bison hunters or the arrival of the first trappers introducing a new land use. So the energy sector arrives, and as you folks know, continues to be a major driver economically. So if you have all these land uses and they're growing, not surprisingly, you've got an opportunity for a stable population, a lot of fecundity, a lot of immigration, and Alberta's population continues to grow. Maybe you'll go back 1930s. So here, we've got, I don't know, about 300,000–400,000 people. 80% live in the country. They're farmers. Since you know acres people back then. 80% rural, 20% urban. Our population marches on to today, and now we're 80% urban, 20% rural. Most of us live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, but I want to back up, look at most of the rural residential, and it's primarily on the west side of the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. And if I back up to the 1940s, almost all the rural people are living on the other side. So key point here, from a forestry standpoint I want to make, is that 12% of all Albertans live in acreages. They want to look west. They don't want to look east. They want to live in forests. And the hundreds of billions of dollars of embedded personal residence infrastructure we're building in a forest matrix is not inconsequential. We had a talk earlier today about fire and fire risk. That's going to continue to be an issue. And as the model shows, we're going to put another several 100,000 people in the next 3 or 4 decades into rural residential and primarily west of the corridor. But you've got to feed those people, and you do it with crops, so the croplands take off through the shortgrass prairies and west into the foothills, consuming some forests. North into the parkland, we see a good chunk of that parkland forest, almost all of it disappear, and Peace River takes off, and croplands continue to expand. It has leveled off recently. It continues to expand every year. It's expanding by about 7,000 hectares every single year. It's being consumed by about 14,000 hectares every single year. And the cropland industry probably will continue to expand, and under a climate change scenario, and I'm running a non-climate change scenario here, we're going to see it continue to expand into what was areas that were dominated by forest, particularly the southern boreal forest. So the energy sector, not much going on in early decades, and here we go. And it's important to pay attention to the legends. This may look really, really busy, but red means 8% of every square kilometer. But this talk is all about a whole bunch of small things add up to something meaningful. And the hydrocarbon sector has grown, and a lot of it's been in the non-white area, and it consumes footprint, creates a tremendous amount of access too. Okay. So we couldn't have got where we are today without transforming the landscape, so have we? Yeah, if you include improved pasture in the cropland, 11 million hectares. Some of that was forest. Most of it was grassland, probably 25% was forest. We put 340,000 acreage owners, and I'm not talking about buffered footprint, this is direct house and yard. The acreage people in Alberta and in the boreal forest exceed the area in all of our settlements of cities and towns, which is 250,000 hectares. We have put cattle on about 14 million hectares of private public land. We've got over 1 million hectares directly in the energy sector footprint with seismic lines, well sites, pipelines, and processing plants. Alberta's 68 million hectares. There's about 24 million hectares currently in FMAs, about half of which is merchantable forest. So if it's 24 million hectares, about half is merchantable. We've got about 12 million hectares of forest that we have to log once a rotation, which on average is about 100 years. So 12 million, 1.2, so there you've got about, the 120 million hectares that could be logged, sorry, 120,000 hectares that could be logged per year. We don't log at max AAC. I think we're year to year 75 to 80,000 hectares per year. So it's a big land use with big benefits, conceivably, and large challenges. And we got 400,000 hectares in transportation. None of these land uses today are acceptable at their current level to government and industry. They're all in a growth trajectory, all in a province that's finite in size. If you add them all up and you consider the merchantable part of the forest sector, if we could all get back here at the end of the first rotation, we're not through the first rotation in forestry, 77% of all Alberta should have received a direct footprint. Now, of course, a lot of these footprints do reclaim. Well-site access roads can reclaim, and the whole forest sector is based on the concept of every hectare we log, we apply some sort of silvicultural treatment, which could be clear-cut leaf or natural. That's a treatment, and it reclaims back. But we will have at least touched and cut blocked in forestry and energy and agriculture and transportation over 3/4 of the province of Alberta by our current allocations. We don't need more allocations to make that happen. Okay, so there's a trade-off. We see it in so many ways, and I don't have time to talk about too many, but water quality is really important, and water quality, if you look at nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, is going down, and here you get to see where it is. It's interesting. There appears to be so much conversation, and the model suggests it's going to continue to decline. Note the scale doesn't go to zero, but the vast majority of the conversation is about the oil sands. It's about the energy sector, more specifically oil sands. There's a fair bit of discussion about forestry. Both are very deserving conversations, deserve probably even more attention, but the model's clear that the key issues with respect to water quality in Alberta, if you were to add up the whole bucket, is agriculture. The natural landscape is also changing. Relative to 100% of what it was, 68 million hectares, it's gone down. See, the scale is only 650 to 510. We're talking about thousands of square kilometers here. So we've lost some natural landscape, and we're going to continue. And particularly in our climate change scenarios where the current distribution of crops is not going to be a good match with respect to climate, temperature, and evapotranspiration, it's going to move. And as we had good discussions earlier today, it's highly likely that a lot of the commercial forests, whether they're talking about the hardwood-dominated, conifer-dominated, or mixed-wood systems, today are a product of a previous climate. As we log them, as they're burned, they will adjust themselves in mortality and distribution. So, wouldn't it be interesting to know today what this place would look like in 100 years? Today's presentations for you folks basically is 8 hours long. So what will happen in the next or in today's 8 hours, if this 8 hours was an average 8 hours of any other 8 hours in the province of Alberta, 24/7. Every 8 hours, our settlements expand by 10 hectares. We drill 14 new well sites on average every 8 hours. Albertans drive 40 million kilometers in personal vehicles every 8 hours. We produce over 4,000 metric ton of waste every 8 hours. Our population grows by 87 people every 8 hours. We log 72 hectares every 8 hours. So those numbers might look quite small, but there's more than 8 hours in a year, and it just goes on and on and on, right? So these are the commodities we're producing, and they create phenomenal benefits, but they also change the landscape. And this province that seems so big is now seeming so small, and foresters are not alone in the woods. They're bumping into quad people and mountain bike people and me on a horse, and the oil and gas sector, and some agriculturists that want to expand croplands, and it's just a really busy place. So to kind of end this preamble, one of the things the LCS group started a couple years ago was an initiative to build some online software that was web delivered that could be used by anyone as long as you had access to a laptop and the internet, and be able to quickly see where we are, no matter where you zoom into Alberta, how you got to where we are, and explore the future in a variety of scenarios. And we had some discussions, I think Rick touched on it quite nicely, that the moment you simulate anything into the future, the probability of being right is 0. So we don't simulate the future to be right, because that's impossible. We simulate the future to be explicit about our assumptions and to explore the consequences of scenario A versus B versus C. And I think one of the things you guys heard this morning is if you're only looking at land use, growing fast or slow or here or there, you're probably missing something critically important. And I just didn't come here understanding that there'd be such an emphasis on climate change. I was so impressed that you guys are bringing in climate change scientists to discuss how it's going to influence everything from survivorship of trees to expansion of land uses to probability of fire. It's just going to be a wild ride for anyone in the forest sector in the next several decades. So you guys need tools. You need to look into the future. You need to consider actions. This is where simulation models come in. You need to explore the benefits and liabilities of this versus that. You know, as Rick talked about climate change from this cold model to this hot model. Those are examples of different scenarios. And yeah, landscape's busy, and if I came back in 2 years, these numbers wouldn't be correct. Some, probably forestry, would be about the same because we're logging on a sustained cut basis. Others continue to grow. And again, you've got to factor in climate change. So it's going to take a new mindset. You know, Rick used the word deterministic, which is the way, you know, I think my dad, when I was born, was one of 2 biologists in the province of Alberta. He had a mandate for all fish and wildlife north of Edmonton, and there was another guy that did it all south. And listening to him as I grew up, he worked with these guys called forest custodians. They were the Alberta Forest Service people, right? And there was like 10 of them for every one of him, and they had northern Alberta, and they collected data and they talked. But the kind of challenges that confronted my father and his colleagues are different than the ones that confront us today and are going to be different for the youngsters. It's going to require a new mindset. It's going to be one where you guys can't function only thinking in a silo of forestry, because the landscape is a recipient of all overlapping land use practices and natural disturbances. So you need to have the skills and tools to explore these different options. And there's going to be a lot of questions about, you know, on the left here, that's kind of me and my house and what I need now. I call that the hear me now dynamic that defines a severely normal Albertan, because it's all about me, it isn't about you. And it's all about here, it isn't about regions, and it's all about now, because I really don't care about my kids. And I'm not saying that entirely tongue-in-cheek. There's too much of that kind of thinking in Alberta. And I think Albertans are waking up to realize that, hey, we're pro-land use, we're pro-forestry, energy, agriculture, and transportation, but we got to find a way of conducting forestry and energy and agriculture in a way that delivers those commodities, but doesn't compromise meaningfully other things that really do count through space and time: water quality, water quantity, carbon, biodiversity. And not all of them are equally important. I'd trade off biodiversity in a nanosecond relative to water and soils. But we are trading things off, and I think we're doing it in absence of discussion, and I think this is going to balance. And forestry, you know, whether you're a technologist or you know, forest scientist or a policy guy or gal, there'll be a lot of conversation, because forestry ranks right up there with croplands in total area. And despite what some of us might say about the forest sector, no, we don't drive the economy here. We don't drive GDP. We don't drive employment. If you start adding up all the jobs and all the GDP and the royalties, it's big in absolute numbers and it's inconsequential in some others if you compare it to other land uses. So really important questions are going to be asked, and really good answers are required. And forestry is going to have to change. And it can be highly profitable. In society, people like me that live in cities are going to have to grow up a little bit and talk with our wallet and start rewarding forestry to grow commodities more than just hardwood and softwood, and grow carbon and water quality and hardwood and softwood. And those that conduct those businesses need to be economically rewarded. It's a whole conversation about alternative economic instruments. Those of you that are starting your career in Alberta, you will actually see this marketplace unfold, I believe. Foresters need to be sitting around the table, not just talking to themselves. They need to be sitting with ecologists and soil scientists and range people and climate change people and First Nations and hydrologists, because we're managing a system, we're not managing trees. And so the U of A program and others, I think, are doing a fine job of creating new students and professionals that understand it's a system we're managing and not managing trees. Okay, so with that preamble, what our group has been doing for a couple of years is to try and create a tool that would allow professional foresters and others to understand Alberta, whether it's on a laptop or an iPad or even on your phone. So if I can figure out how to use Windows. And the other problems I have is I've got an ailment called familial tremor, so my fingers wiggle. Okay, so let's see if we can make this thing work. To make this work, you need access to an internet, you need access to a computer. And you just type in an address, www.onlinelcs.ca, put in a password, and away you go. And so what we're going to try and do, and I've created this landscape, where I'm primarily interested in the north here. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay. So most of our conversation is not about the grassland, so let's focus on the boreal here. And we're going to talk about various land uses. So all I'm going to do is I've typed in human population. It's conducted a simulation online, and I want to show you it's kind of iffy connection, isn't it? Okay. I'll do my best. Try not to touch it. Now. Oh, come on now. How do I make this go up? Okay. I actually practiced for a couple hours last night so I could use my Mac system nicely. But let's see what we can do. Okay. One of the first things we need to understand is that the human population, go back to 1910. We saw that one before. We're just going to simulate it. 20s, 30s, 40s. We've already seen this graph. So let's remind ourselves that we have land use because we have people. Now the commodities we're producing, whether it be hardwood, softwood, oil, gas, crops, whether they be cereals or oil seeds, and our minerals, are primarily not for domestic consumption. They're primarily for export. So let's remind ourselves that we're primarily an export province. But the population is growing, and as it grows, it's going to need more resources. So we need to know the human population. I'm going to try anyway. Why does this not want to work? Okay, I'm going to try crop. And I'm going to ask it for a new variable, just total cropland, and click go. It's sending out a signal. It's running an online GIS. This is a really slow internet connection. Generally, these come in about 2 seconds. At my house, it seems like they're coming in around 7 or 8 seconds, but still unbelievably fast compared to what we might have got many years ago. The GISs, we'll go back and we're going to try and build a story about crops, or sorry, about forestry. So we're expanding our crops. So look where they're expanding, and ask yourselves in a climate or even a non-climate change scenario, where are the croplands going to continue to expand? Because if you put crops and pasture together, you're up around that 14 to 16 million hectares, right? Well, the biomes here is the natural region of boreal forest and Rockies. Okay. The energy sector. So here we're looking at, we could run them separately for conventional oil, conventional gas, unconventional oil, unconventional gas, oil, shale, bitumen, or coal. And we'll get to see where they are and its footprint. So if we look at where we are today, right about there, where we're going to go. So relative to what we have right now, which in the boreal forest, we're looking at about 1.5% of the entire boreal forest is in direct footprint of the energy sector. And you guys in your career can see that, and we'll see that double. And that is with aggressive reclamation. One of the questions that begs, from a forestry standpoint, if I ask the model and say, instead of running it as a normal, I want to run it as a delta. So I'm not going to look at just how much is in an area. I want it now to tell me where is it reclaiming and where is it expanding. And there's a really important dynamic here. There is an immense amount of boreal forest that is slated for reclamation, but it's not in 5 or 6 chunks, it's in 5,000 or 6,000 chunks. And what kind of scenarios do we have? So here, the numbers can be positive or negative. Green to red is increasing growth, and if we look into the, let's say the decade of 2010, 2020, the areas that are blue are areas where the seismic lines and well pads and access roads of those well pads are projected to be coming off the landscape. Because what the model is doing is tracking every well pad, when it started, how much it's producing, when it's anticipated to mature, and then it's putting it on a reclamation trajectory. How well we treat that reclamation trajectory is uncertain. The areas that you see in blue are areas where footprint from the hydrocarbon sector is anticipated to be coming off the landscape. The area in red is where that land use is anticipated to be expanding in this decade. And of course, we could march it on to the next decade here and see the scenario. So it's not the same places. We're growing different hydrocarbons. They all have a history, just like you guys talked about the history of cut blocks and forest dynamics. The well site, the hydrocarbon infrastructure is the same. It's born, it grows, it matures, it dies, and then the question is, what do we do with that? Hundreds of thousands of hectares. Okay, so a little bit of knowledge there on energy, and we've talked about also crops. So I'm going to go back here, and a lot of the issues that confront us on the forestry sector deal with transportation. So I'm going to type total roads, say give us that, maybe in units of kilometers per square kilometer, and we'll run this scenario. And so, again, we're putting roads to well pads, we're putting them to cut blocks, we're building in-block roads, and we're also growing them to acreages. And we can clip this by just FMAs if we want. And so here, because we're still looking at delta, we're looking at the areas in the next decade that are likely to grow. These blue areas are where access roads are intended to come off the landscape. Tremendous uncertainty as to whether or not those in fact will. And a lot of you folks spend more time in the field than I do. So as we're talking about maybe 30,000 to 40,000 wells that are all going to stop producing in this next decade, how many of those will we actually reclaim? Not only the pad itself, but the access road that goes to that pad. Because this creates all sorts of challenging access issues. So that's looking at the change, and if I ask, just show us the total amount that'll be there, we'll get to see it changing through time here. So what this model is doing is it's looking into every square kilometer and looking at anything that's built by humans. So it knows all the cut blocks we have today and when they were cut historically. It's conducting a timber supply based on FMAs and their AACs and their merchantable wood, and it's getting them to cut wood, but it's also burning the landscape. So here, if we go all the way back, to 1910, we had some roads that were growing. It was primarily a white area dynamic, right? 50s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s. Well, go back to some first principles. I think there's some low-hanging fruit here that's been talked about by forest companies and forest management agencies in the government, and it needs to continue, which is, if you got about 28 million hectares of forest, like not all the boreal forest is forest, most of it's wetland actually, and there's 20 million hectares in FMAs, and half of that is MERS. That's 10 million hectares we have to get at once vegetation, and we're not flying our wood out, we're building roads. Are there a lot of roads out there right now? Absolutely. Or alternatively, there's exceptionally few, and they're both accurate statements. There's a lot more than your grandparents would have saw, and today there's very few compared to what we're going to have in 30 or 40 years. as we move our way through the first rotation. And as those new roads get built, the question is, will the forest sector be required to reclaim them? Will there be a conflicting conversation where the recreational community wants to continue to use them to the point where there's not social license to reclaim them? Because these roads are an amazing challenge to so many ecological indicators, whether it's water and runoff or sediment or wildlife habitat, just because it lets everyone get everywhere all the time. So a real key question there. So on the boreal, this is what we've got right now. Okay, so what is it suggesting? With reclamation, with aggressive reclamation, we double in the next half century. 5 decades, for every kilometer road we have in the boreal forest today, it doubles. That's with aggressive reclamation. So who's building those? Yeah, the forest sector to a degree, the hydrocarbon sector, which is just nothing but embryonic, right? It's just been born. We kind of think, yeah, it's tipped over on oil and it's tipped over on gas. Those two land uses have a long trajectory, but bitumen, whether it's surface mining or particularly in situ, is just embryonic. And then we haven't talked about the unconventional oils and gases that have yet to be produced in Alberta. So, why am I showing you all of this? Well, let's take a look at just forest. I can only spell. That's not what I want to do. Go down to total forest. So, you know, listing all this stuff, man, we probably lost all of our forests in the province of Alberta, right? Well, let's see. Models conducting simulations should return us results. Okay, so here's PI is pre-industrial. So that's before, that's, you know, the landscape is being driven by, I guess, First Nations and by fire and insect outbreaks. And you can see in this curve in the lower left, and it is scaled to 0. No, we haven't lost all of our forest. But we're going from about 28 million hectares to what have we lost? About 23.5. Okay, so what, 4.5 million hectares of forest have been lost since Alberta became a province. And you notice it continues to decline, but at a fairly slow rate. And what we're seeing is, again, the net increase of access roads and mine sites and expansion of agriculture. And we're not talking about FMAs here only, we're talking about all the forests, because it's looking into every square, whether it be white area, green area, and expansion of settlements. Okay, so this is a non-climate change scenario, and when we look at it, you know, I see some people that have been in the forest sector in Alberta longer than, well, not that I've been in the forest sector. Well, I guess I have, but not like you guys. Well, let's go back to pre-industrial. This is what we had 100 years ago. The red is you had forest, but just not much of it. That was the parkland. So you had all this native grassland, and you've got all these wetland complexes scattered throughout. And here is what's been going on with your forest. 1920s and 30s, 40s, and you can see Peace River as an agricultural area takes off, and agriculture is pushing it north into the southern part of the boreal forest, and the hydrocarbon sector is doing its thing, and your forest is a little bit smaller. There's two key drivers to the forest sector from just a timber production standpoint. Area doesn't matter if all your forest is 5 years old. And having all of it 150 years old doesn't matter if you only got 2 hectares. So the two key drivers in the forest sector has historically been area times age, gives you a modest index of volume. So what has been going on, if we ask the model to look at every Class C fire that's ever been burned in Alberta where it's been recorded, and looks at the antiquity of every cut block that we have, so I'll just type in forest age, and it tells me that I don't know how to type. Try that again. I'm not becoming a big fan of Windows yet. Click go, and it's going to help us understand forest age. You know what I'm going to do? I made a bit of a mistake. I'm going to ask it for range and natural variability, or using the best known fire return intervals for each of the natural subregions. I'm going to click on map here and say, hey, add that range and natural variability years get it to run. And then we're going to see kind of 10 random slices of changes in forest age when it was just being driven by essentially lightning-induced fire. And then humans come on the landscape, so now we've got anthropogenic sources, but now we're trying to impose fire suppression. And if fires are affecting age of forests, they're now not alone in the forest. Something called logging that has arrived. And so now let's go right back here to range of natural variability. And so I'll just click all the way back. And we'll actually see the time series of age, because there's been a lot of conversation. I think I even heard some conflicting things. The forest is getting older. The forest is getting younger. Well, these are expressions. Red is very, very young. Green is very, very old in this one. And you're seeing our forest shift through time. We're still in range of natural variability. And now we're 1910, 1920s, 30s. We've had some big fires in certain areas. A lot of red, some pretty young landscape. And it's been creeping back up in age. I mean, we've got tremendous variation. We've got forests that are 0 years of age. They were logged or burned this year. We've got forests that are 250 to 280 years old. But here we get to see the time series, and we could add a band, make it green, and try and explore the range of natural variability of forests at a time where there wasn't Europeans. We're recognizing we're conflicted because we don't really know how much First Nations, we know they're burning the landscape, but we don't really know how much. And so here's a range of natural variability, and then the forest gets quite younger between basically late 1800s and about 1940, and then has been getting older. So what does that tell us? If it's getting older, it means the rate of perturbation, which is driven by fire and logging, is less than the rate at which it's aging. So yes, clearly we've had a fire suppression effect. Another thing that's driving young forests is that we are reclaiming some areas, and of course the moment we reclaim them, they start as really, really young forests. Okay, so we've looked at forest area, and we've looked at forest age, and we could look at annual allowable cut, or not annual allowable cut, but just actually look at timber production, and we can see where the timber production has been in the past. We can look at deciduous and coniferous, but I'm just going to say let's put them together and ask it to remind us where you've got the cut blocks. Now, I continue to wonder, and maybe you guys have some advice as to what would be the best kind of non-published source of trying to reconstruct logging in the province of Alberta in the late 1800s through about 1930. Because there would have been an immense amount of logging to keep the population going. Probably a lot of like diameter limit, high grading, close to settlements. People like Peter Murphy might be the best source, but some of those people are getting quite old. It'd be nice to try and gain that information, so all I can do is rebuild it by knowing the decade of origin of every cut block and where it is. And so here we're going to look at the history of cut blocks. Can you guys still hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Okay, we're going to go back. Where are we here? Come on, computer. Okay, 1910, we're logging through this area. There's no cut blocks. Here comes the 1940s, and you can see what these FMAs are doing. It's distributing cuts. Of course, we don't do it uniformly. We have our operating licenses. We go in there and we harvest. This data is all coming in on decadal changes. And to stop that, we'll go. Okay. Still learning this here. Okay, we'll start back in the 1940s and grow it to where we are today. 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010. Now, as we grow it into the future, because the model is also burning the landscape, it's distributing cut for every FMA or embedded quota holder and showing not the right, but possible or plausible ways in which we're going to harvest the landscape as the model looks for land that's inside of FMAs and is the right mix in the age class structure and the piece size and logs it. So the point is, if we ask the indicator to give us the total amount of area logged, which is what it's doing right now. Excuse me. to today. All we should be reminded is that we're an extensive land use. Basically, we have to conduct a treatment on 10 million hectares once a century. It's, the very, very raw math of forestry in Alberta. And here you get to see those areas that have been part of cut blocks. So we could then fade that off and say, okay, LCs, bring in all the known cut block data. And there it is. Maybe we put that on the satellite image. Okay, that's what we've logged so far. Those are cumulatives. Of course, a lot of those cut blocks are back into being old forests, but that's everything we know we've logged. And we can look at it decade by decade. And no, we're not through the first rotation, so we still have a ways to go. So the key point is that we're certainly imposing a treatment. We're getting hardwood and softwood fiber off the landscape. It's got some jobs and royalties and rents. And are we conducting it in a way that's treating other things quite well? So we looked at water quality and we saw it's gone down. We could look at carbon, we could look at edge density, we could look at all sorts of things. We could be looking at white-tailed deer, we could be looking at moose. And how are things changing? What other things does society want? One of the key things that a lot of species seem to be sensitive to, if I go back to normal, is core area. So I'm just going to ask it to report out on this. And remind ourselves that we've lost core area in the grasslands from an agriculture perspective, and we've also lost a lot of it in the boreal forest. You can't conduct these land uses without building linear features. The question is, and have we had this conversation? Well, I'll just dissolve off the cut blocks and go back here to pre-industrial. Is we've been increasing the amount of core area. Sorry, we've been increasing the amount of edge and reducing the amount of core area. There needs to be a conversation about thresholds. One of the key things is how many kilometers per square kilometer are we going to have out on these land bases? We've been part of this conversation for 15 years in the province of Alberta. A lot of things fall apart at about 2 kilometers per square kilometer. We should do something about that. And then we get to 3. In some places in Alberta, we're at 15 kilometers per square kilometer, most of it attributed to the oil and gas sector. So let's just ask ourselves for one other variable in the boreal forest and just say edge density. And this is everything. We could ask it for just cut block edges or whatever. But let's run it for everyone in the boreal forest and see where we are and where we're going. And ask ourselves, how could we impose a system where if I'm logging the landscape or building something, okay, here's 2010 on average in Alberta, and on average in Alberta's boreal forest, we are at, well, what is it? Thank you. We're at 2.6 kilometers per square kilometer. On some of these land bases, again, we're well over 10. You can see Hayzama, Fort McMurray quite nicely. Let's figure out how we got to that. So most of that edge is white zone initially, and now it's expanding. But as we have the hydrocarbon sector and forestry, this model should stop at the decade of 2010. You get to see where we are, and a lot of landscape ecologists would say that got this working or not, that we shouldn't be more than about 2. So we're past it, and it's going to increase. So I guess the question is, why aren't we logging the landscapes in such a way that for every kilometer we put in, a kilometer goes out? Particularly in the energy sector where they've got so much linear edge, why aren't we asking for a 2-to-1 ratio? These may seem like high dollars, but in fact they're not. There's a tremendous opportunity still for the forestry sector and the energy sector to do more communication and talk about building a functional integrated transportation network. We haven't done as much of that as we could. So, I'm just going to ask, as we move around different places, ask the model to dissolve some stuff off here. here where, you guys know where Water Valley is, we'll just grab a chunk of landscape, and I'm just going to ask the model to drape on all footprints. And just make this mouse work. Come on now. There we go. It's not the one I want, it's this one right here. I can't make this work. Stupid mouse. No, it's coming in. Okay, so there's that. Here all we're looking at is the roads, the seismic lines, the well sites, the pipelines, the expansion of agriculture. Just reminding ourselves how busy this place is. So what do we do about it? Where do we want to go? I mean, there is this trade-off. The science is clear. The question is, can the forest sector play a role? I'm going to go back here to the PowerPoint. To what extent can the forest sector play a catalyzing role in a conversation about a new way forward? Recognizing that, yeah, Albertans want land use. They want that prosperity. We want that quality of life. But when you ask Albertans what they think about water quality or carbon or air or biodiversity or landscape metrics, they want that stuff too. So it's not like it's a disaster. It's just a matter of putting the forest sector and all the other natural capital on the table and having an explicit conversation and not externalizing that stuff like we've done historically. You can't do it, I believe, without a conversation about how you reward the forest sector to provide these other commodities. And you can't have that conversation in a vacuum outside of natural disturbances and climate change. So I just can't imagine it could get any more complex for those in the forest sector than it is right now. The hydrocarbon sector, they want to get dead trees out of the ground. There's only a finite volume. They're not worried about regrowing that stuff. It's a pool from which they're extracting. It's a non-renewable resource. The forest sector is intended to build landscapes in the future with mindful objectives that balance a whole bunch of things in which fiber is only one. And that conversation, I think, hasn't been as balanced as it could be. And this tool is intended to allow people, I didn't really show it to you in the sense that when you simulate it, I think it's kind of crashed, the internet's gone down on me. But when you simulate it, let's see if I can bring it back. Then you can grow it into the future in a variety of scenarios. The model lets you grow forestry, energy, agriculture fast or slow, allows you to build different protected areas to run it with and without climate change, and help you understand that there's many potential future frontiers in Alberta. And it's worth understanding those before we actually get out there and conduct land uses. We can think about the future. So with that, I think I'll call it quits, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come chat to you. I don't know if there's time for a few questions or not. If there's any questions, I guess there's a few minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me? I think we use Got it? Thank you very much, Dr. Stelbeck. Our next speaker